With only 2 weeks left before her mother's insurance would lapse, Zara Williams was willing to take any job that paid enough to cover the $15,000 needed for experimental cancer treatment. She never imagined that desperation would lead her through the wrong door at Seoul's most exclusive nightclub, directly into the private meeting of Park Jin-hyung, a man whose business was conducted in blood and silence. One look at her terrified face told him everything he needed to know about the mistake she had made, and everything he needed to decide about what would happen next. At 24, Zara had been juggling 3 jobs while maintaining her final year of medical school at Seoul National University. She was practical, focused, and had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and endless determination. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and warm brown eyes that had seen too much worry for someone so young. She was tall and graceful, moving through life with the efficiency of someone who could not afford to waste time or energy. Her dream had been simple: finish medical school, become a doctor, and ensure her mother never worried about medical bills again. Instead, she was standing in the employment office of Club Onyx at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, signing papers for a cocktail waitress position that paid more in one evening than her other 3 jobs combined. The money was too good to question. The manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Chun, had looked at Zara's resume with obvious approval. Pre-med student, clean record, reliable references. Perfect for our VIP clientele, she had said. The club catered to Seoul's elite business community, men who valued discretion and expected flawless service. Zara would work Thursday through Saturday nights, serving drinks and maintaining absolute professional silence about anything she might overhear. The pay would cover her mother's treatment with enough left over to finish school without drowning in debt. Ms. Chen walked her through the club's layout quickly. The main floor was elegant but standard, all dark wood and soft lighting designed to make wealthy men feel comfortable parting with their money. The real money, however, was made upstairs in the VIP lounges. Each private room was numbered. Each served specific clients who paid extraordinary amounts for privacy and exclusivity. Zara's job was simple. When the light above a door turned green, she would enter with whatever had been requested, serve professionally, and leave without acknowledging anything she might have witnessed. The uniform was tasteful, a black dress that was form-fitting but not revealing, paired with comfortable heels that allowed her to move quickly between rooms. Zara felt professional and confident as she started her shift, carrying silver trays of premium whiskey and imported wine to men in expensive suits who barely acknowledged her presence. This was exactly what she needed: anonymous work that paid well and allowed her to remain invisible. The mistake happened during her 3rd hour. Room 7 had requested a bottle of 25-year-old Macallan, and Zara balanced the heavy crystal decanter carefully as she walked down the dimly lit corridor. The hallway was designed for discretion, with soft carpeting that muffled footsteps and recessed lighting that created pools of shadow between the doors. She had been thinking about her mother's next doctor appointment, calculating how many more shifts would cover the cost of the new treatment protocol, when she realized she had stopped in front of the wrong door. The light above room 8 was green, not room 7. Zara hesitated for a moment, checking the number again. Room 8. She had been certain the order was for 7, but the green light indicated she was expected. Perhaps Ms. Chun had redirected the order without informing her. Zara knocked softly and pushed the door open when a voice called for her to enter. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was terribly wrong. Room 8 was not like the other VIP lounges she had served. This room was clearly designed for serious business, with a massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs and walls lined with monitors displaying financial data in real time. The lighting was brighter, more clinical, and the atmosphere was heavy with tension that had nothing to do with casual entertainment. 5 men sat around the table, all wearing dark, perfectly tailored suits that spoke of wealth and power beyond anything she had encountered downstairs. Documents were spread across the polished surface, along with photographs and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. The conversation stopped the moment she entered, and 5 pairs of eyes turned to assess her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. At the head of the table sat a man who commanded the room simply by existing in it. Park Jin-hyung was in his late 30s, Korean, with sharp, almost severe features and dark hair styled with precision. His suit was impeccable, clearly custom-made, and he wore it with the confidence of someone who had never needed to question his authority. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely unreadable as they studied her face with careful attention. Everything about him radiated controlled power, from the way he held his hands folded on the table to the slight tilt of his head as he examined her unexpected presence. This was not a man who entertained in nightclub lounges. This was a man who made decisions that changed lives, and Zara had just stumbled into whatever serious business required such secrecy. "I brought the Macallan you requested, sir," Zara managed to say, her voice steady despite the fear climbing her throat. "We did not request anything," Park Jin-hyung replied, his voice low and measured, carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room wait for his words. "You are in the wrong place at the wrong time." The man to his left, younger and clearly agitated by the interruption, leaned forward with obvious hostility. "She has seen too much already," he said, his voice sharp with implication. "We cannot allow her to leave and repeat what she has witnessed here tonight." Zara felt the weight of the situation crash down on her like cold water. These were not ordinary businessmen conducting ordinary meetings. The documents on the table, the surveillance equipment, the way they spoke about her, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person who had made an honest mistake, all of it pointed to something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. Her hands began to tremble as she gripped the crystal decanter, and she could feel her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. She was trapped in a situation she did not understand, surrounded by men who clearly had the resources and willingness to ensure their secrets remained protected. The smart thing to do would be to apologize and back out of the room, but the way they were looking at her suggested that leaving was no longer an option they were prepared to offer. Park Jin-hyung continued to study her face with that same careful attention, and Zara had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than she wanted to reveal. His dark eyes tracked her expression, noting the fear she was trying to control and the way her breathing had become shallow and quick. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, something almost thoughtful. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Zara Williams, sir," she answered, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "How long have you worked here, Zara Williams?" "This is my first night, sir." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle change that she could not quite interpret. He glanced at the documents on the table, then back at her face, and she had the distinct impression that he was making some kind of calculation that had nothing to do with the bottle of whiskey she was still holding like a shield. "She made an honest mistake," Park Jin-hyung said finally, addressing the other men at the table rather than her. "She entered the wrong room during her first shift. That is not a crime that requires the solution you are suggesting." The younger man who had spoken before looked genuinely confused by this mercy. "Sir, she has witnessed sensitive information. Protocol requires that we protect our interests," Park Jin-hyung interrupted smoothly. "It does not require that we create unnecessary problems by harming innocent people who pose no actual threat." He stood then, moving with fluid grace to pour himself a drink from a different bottle that had been sitting on a side table. His movements were controlled and purposeful, and Zara found herself watching the way his expensive suit fit perfectly across his shoulders, the way his hands moved with casual confidence. When he turned back to face her, she felt pinned under the full weight of his attention. "You will forget what you have seen in this room tonight," he told her, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "You will return to your duties and speak of this to no one. In return, you will have my protection for as long as you work in this establishment." The promise of protection should have been reassuring, but something in the way he said it made Zara realize that Park Jin-hyung was not offering her safety so much as claiming responsibility for her welfare. She was no longer just an employee who had made a mistake. She had become something far more complicated. A person whose continued existence was now tied directly to his decision to show mercy rather than eliminate a potential threat. "Yes, sir," she whispered, not trusting her voice to carry any stronger. Park Jin-hyung nodded once, a gesture of dismissal that somehow also felt like the beginning of something she could not yet understand. "Leave the bottle and go," he said quietly. "And Zara Williams, remember that some doors, once opened, change everything that follows." As she set the crystal decanter on the side table and backed toward the door, Zara realized that her desperate need for money had led her into something far more dangerous and complex than any job she had ever imagined. She had walked into the wrong room and found herself under the protection of a man whose power came from places she did not want to think about too deeply. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving her alone in the dimly lit corridor with the knowledge that her life had just taken a turn she could never have anticipated. Park Jin-hyung had saved her from whatever fate his associates had been suggesting, but she understood instinctively that his protection came with expectations she was not yet prepared to comprehend. Whatever business Park Jin-hyung conducted in room 8 was not her concern, but as she returned to serving drinks to ordinary wealthy men in the ordinary VIP rooms, Zara could not shake the feeling that her brief encounter with controlled danger had marked her in some way that would not easily be forgotten or ignored. She needed this job desperately, and Park Jin-hyung had made it clear that she could continue working under his protection. What she did not yet realize was that his interest in her welfare had moved beyond simple mercy and into territory that would soon reshape everything she thought she knew about safety, choices, and the price of accepting help from a man who dealt in power and silence. The business card appeared on her service tray the following Thursday, slipped between the silverware while she was serving a table of real estate investors who barely acknowledged her existence. Heavy cardstock, cream-colored with only a name and phone number embossed in dark ink. Park Jin-hyung, followed by 10 digits that somehow felt more significant than any contact information she had ever seen. Zara discovered it during her break, sitting in the small employee lounge in Club Onyx's basement level. The sight of his name printed in elegant font made her heart race with the same fear she had felt 3 nights ago when she had stumbled into room 8. She had managed to convince herself that the encounter had been a strange one-time event, something she could file away and forget as she focused on the legitimate work that would fund her mother's treatment. Finding his business card meant that Park Jin-hyung had not forgotten about her, and that her involvement in his world was far from over. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, floor 7, private elevator behind the bar, code 8247. 10 minutes. Zara stared at the message, realizing that Park Jin-hyung was not making a request. He was issuing a summons, and she understood instinctively that failing to respond was not an option he was prepared to accept. She had been working at Club Onyx for exactly 1 week, and already she was being drawn into something that went far beyond serving drinks to wealthy businessmen who valued discretion. The private elevator was exactly where he had indicated, concealed behind a panel that looked like part of the bar's decorative woodwork. Zara entered the code with trembling fingers and watched the doors close as the elevator carried her to a floor she had not known existed. When the doors opened, she found herself in a corridor that belonged to an entirely different world than the nightclub below. The 7th floor was clearly Park Jin-hyung's private domain. The hallway was lined with original artwork and furnished with pieces that spoke of wealth beyond anything she had encountered in the VIP lounges. Everything was designed to convey power and permanence, from the marble floors to the custom lighting that created an atmosphere of exclusivity and control. Park Jin-hyung was waiting for her in what appeared to be his personal office, a space that commanded respect through its sheer scale and attention to detail. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seoul's financial district, and the room was furnished with a massive desk, leather seating, and technology that suggested this was the nerve center of operations far more complex than entertainment. He was dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, this one charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that emphasized his tall frame and broad shoulders. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp features were composed in an expression of calm authority that made it clear he was accustomed to having his instructions followed without question. "Sit," Park Jin-hyung said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned across from his desk. Zara obeyed automatically, noting the way the expensive leather seemed to embrace her as she settled into the chair. Everything in the room was designed to impress and intimidate, and she felt acutely aware of how out of place she was in this environment of luxury and power. "You have been thinking about our encounter in room 8, he stated, his dark eyes studying her face with the same careful attention she remembered from their first meeting. "Yes, sir," Zara admitted, seeing no point in lying to a man who clearly missed nothing. Good. That shows intelligence. He moved around the desk to pour himself a drink from a crystal decanter, his movements controlled and purposeful. You understand that what you witnessed was not a casual business meeting. I understand that it was private and important, and that I should not have been there, Zara replied carefully. Park Jin-hyung nodded approvingly at her discretion. What you witnessed was a strategic planning session for operations that require absolute secrecy and complete loyalty from everyone who has knowledge of them. The men in that room represent significant financial and political interests throughout Seoul and beyond. He returned to his chair, settling back with the casual confidence of someone who had never needed to question his authority. The drink in his hand was amber-colored and clearly expensive, another reminder of the vast difference in their circumstances and resources. Your presence in that room created a situation that required a decision about your future, Park Jin-hyung continued. My associates believe that ensuring your silence required permanent solutions. I chose a different approach. Zara felt her mouth go dry as the implications of his words settled in her mind. She had been closer to genuine danger than she had realized, and Park Jin-hyung's decision to protect her had quite possibly saved her life. However, your continued employment in this establishment under normal circumstances presents ongoing complications, he said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. You now possess information that makes you a security risk, and you have demonstrated that accidents and mistakes are possible even with good intentions. He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding hers with unmistakable intensity. Therefore, I am prepared to offer you an alternative arrangement that will address both your financial needs and my security concerns. What kind of arrangement? Zara asked, though she suspected that whatever Park Jin-hyung was about to propose would change her life in ways she was not prepared to consider. You are a medical student in your final year, with excellent grades and practical experience, he stated, making it clear that he had investigated her background thoroughly. My organization requires medical services that must be provided with complete discretion and absolute reliability. I am prepared to offer you a position as my personal medical consultant. The title sounded official and legitimate, but Zara understood that Park Jin-hyung's organization was not the kind that appeared in public business directories or filed standard employment reports with government agencies. The compensation would be $100,000 annually, paid monthly in cash, Park Jin-hyung continued, his voice matter-of-fact as he stated a figure that represented more money than Zara had ever imagined earning. Your responsibilities would include providing medical care for my associates when required, maintaining complete confidentiality about all patients and treatments, and ensuring that no records of your services are kept in any official capacity. Zara felt her heart pounding as the scope of what he was offering began to register. $100,000 would cover her mother's experimental treatment, her own remaining tuition, and provide security she had never imagined possible. In addition to your salary, your mother's cancer treatment would be fully funded through private medical facilities that provide the highest quality care without insurance limitations or bureaucratic delays, he added, making it clear that his investigation of her circumstances had been comprehensive. The apartment provided for your use would be in one of Seoul's most secure residential buildings, with all expenses covered and privacy guaranteed, Park Jin-hyung stated, outlining benefits that seemed almost impossible to believe. Your safety would be my personal responsibility, and my protection extends to your family members as well. He paused, allowing her to absorb the full scope of what he was offering. In return, I require absolute loyalty, complete discretion, and your commitment to prioritize the medical needs of my organization above all other professional considerations. Zara stared at him, trying to process an offer that solved every financial problem she had while creating moral complications she had never imagined facing. What you are asking me to do is treat people who have been injured in illegal activities, she said slowly. What I am asking you to do is practice medicine according to the oath you will take as a physician, to heal those who need healing without judgment about the circumstances that created their need, Park Jin-hyung replied smoothly. And if I refuse this arrangement? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. If you refuse, you will return to your current employment with my protection and the understanding that our paths will not cross again, he said, his tone neutral but somehow final. However, your financial situation will remain unchanged, and your mother's treatment options will continue to be limited by insurance coverage and your ability to work multiple jobs while completing medical school. He set his drink on the desk and leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving her face. The choice is entirely yours, Zara Williams. I am offering you a solution to problems that currently have no other viable resolution. Zara felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Everything Park Jin-hyung was offering represented security and opportunities that would transform not only her life, but her mother's chance of survival. The salary alone would eliminate every source of stress and worry that kept her awake at night, and the promise of funding her mother's treatment removed the time pressure that had been driving her to increasingly desperate measures. But accepting his offer meant crossing a line into a world where healing came with secrecy, where her medical skills would serve people whose injuries resulted from violence and illegal activities, and where her loyalty would belong to a man whose power derived from sources she preferred not to examine too closely. She thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed, growing weaker each day while insurance companies debated coverage for experimental treatments. She thought about the mounting debt from medical bills that threatened to destroy any chance of financial stability, even if the treatment was successful. She thought about working 3 jobs while trying to complete medical school, knowing that exhaustion was making her less effective at everything and helping no one. Park Jin-hyung was offering her the resources to solve all of these problems immediately and completely. The money he was proposing would eliminate every source of financial stress and provide security she had never imagined possible. Her mother would receive the best possible medical care without limits or delays, and Zara would be able to focus on becoming the best physician she was capable of being. The moral implications were significant, but Park Jin-hyung had made a valid point about the nature of medical practice. Doctors treated patients without investigating how they had been injured or whether they had been engaged in legal activities when their injuries occurred. Emergency rooms provided care to everyone who needed it, regardless of their background or circumstances. If she accepted his offer, she would be practicing medicine within a more exclusive and secretive context, but the fundamental principle remained the same, providing healing to those who needed it. The difference was that Park Jin-hyung's organization would compensate her far better than any hospital or clinic, and the security he provided would extend to protecting her mother as well as herself. She looked into his dark eyes and saw patience and certainty, as if he knew that her circumstances left her with only one rational choice. He was not pressuring her or threatening consequences for refusal. He was simply offering a solution that addressed her needs while serving his interests, and waiting for her to recognize the logic of accepting his proposal. "I accept your offer, Mr. Park," Zara said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to undertake. Park Jin-hyung smiled for the first time since she had met him, a subtle expression of satisfaction that transformed his severe features into something almost approachable. "Excellent," he said, reaching into his desk drawer to retrieve a sleek black phone. "This will be your direct line to me and the primary method for receiving instructions about your responsibilities." He placed the phone on the desk between them, a tangible symbol of the agreement they had just made. "Your first assignment will be to complete your medical degree with the highest possible grades while maintaining absolute silence about this arrangement. Your salary begins immediately, and your mother's transfer to private treatment will be arranged within the week." As Zara picked up the phone, she realized that Park Jin-hyung had not just offered her a job. He had brought her into his world completely, making her welfare and her family's security dependent on his continued protection and approval. She was no longer just an employee who had stumbled into something dangerous. She was now a willing participant in an organization whose activities she could only guess at, and her future was tied directly to a man whose power came from places she was not yet prepared to fully understand. The transaction was complete, and there was no possibility of returning to the life she had been living just minutes before. Park Jin-hyung had identified her desperation, offered a solution that she could not refuse, and secured her loyalty through generosity that came with expectations she was only beginning to comprehend. 3 months after accepting Park Jin-hyung's proposition, Zara Williams discovered that security could become as addictive as the danger she had escaped. The luxury apartment he had provided occupied the entire 42nd floor of Seoul's most exclusive residential tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city and amenities that transformed daily life into something she had never imagined possible. The apartment was furnished with pieces that belonged in architectural magazines, each item selected for both beauty and function. Italian marble covered the floors, custom lighting created atmosphere that shifted throughout the day, and the kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances she was still learning to use. Everything was designed to convey wealth and taste, and Zara found herself moving through the space with a sense of unreality that had not faded even after 12 weeks of calling it home. Her new life had settled into a routine that felt both surreal and surprisingly comfortable. She completed her final medical school courses during the day, maintaining the excellent grades that Park Jin-hyung expected while preparing for board examinations that would officially make her a licensed physician. Her evenings were spent on call for his organization, providing medical care to associates who required treatment without official records or questions about the circumstances of their injuries. The work was exactly what Park Jin-hyung had described, practicing medicine according to her professional oath while maintaining absolute discretion about patients and treatments. She had treated gunshot wounds, knife injuries, and trauma that clearly resulted from violent encounters, but the men who required her services were always respectful and grateful for her skill. Her medical bag was stocked with equipment that surpassed anything available in most hospital emergency rooms, and she had access to medications and supplies without limitations or bureaucratic delays. Park Jin-hyung had kept every promise he had made during their negotiation. Her mother's cancer treatment had been transferred to Seoul's most advanced private medical facility, where experimental therapies were administered by world-renowned specialists without insurance restrictions or financial concerns. The difference in her mother's condition was remarkable. Color had returned to her face, her energy levels were improving, and the latest scans showed significant tumor reduction that exceeded all previous expectations. Most surprisingly, Zara had begun to find genuine peace in the structure and predictability of her new circumstances. For the first time in years, she was not constantly calculating expenses or working multiple jobs to cover basic necessities. She could focus entirely on her medical studies and the responsibilities Park Jin-hyung had given her, knowing that every other aspect of her life was secure and protected. The evening routine that had developed between them was something she had not anticipated but had come to value more than she cared to admit. Park Jin-hyung would arrive at her apartment most nights around 10 o'clock, usually after completing business that she preferred not to think about too specifically. They would share dinner that had been prepared by a chef who understood exactly what kind of food promoted conversation without requiring formal ceremony. These dinners had become opportunities for Park Jin-hyung to check on her mother's progress, review her medical school performance, and discuss any concerns related to her work with his organization. But gradually, their conversations had expanded to include topics that had nothing to do with business or medical care. He would ask about her studies, share observations about Seoul's changing political climate, and occasionally reveal glimpses of interests and perspectives that made him seem less intimidating and more genuinely human. Tonight, Park Jin-hyung arrived with news that her mother's latest test results showed continued improvement and that her oncologist was optimistic about long-term remission possibilities. He delivered this information with the same careful attention he gave to all matters related to Zara's welfare, and she found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the way his expression softened slightly when discussing her mother's progress. "You have been worried about the next phase of treatment," he observed, correctly reading the concern she had been trying to hide. "The experimental therapy has been very successful, but the next stage requires procedures that are still considered investigational," Zara admitted. "I know you have provided funding for everything so far, but I do not want to assume. You will assume that your mother receives whatever medical care offers the best chance of complete recovery," Park Jin-hyung interrupted gently. "That is not a matter for discussion or concern." His willingness to continue funding treatments that had no guaranteed outcomes, combined with his genuine interest in her mother's welfare, created feelings that Zara was not prepared to examine too closely. Park Jin-hyung had demonstrated care and generosity that went far beyond their business arrangement, and she was beginning to understand that her safety and well-being had become personally important to him in ways that had nothing to do with professional obligations. The shift in their dynamic had been gradual but unmistakable. Park Jin-hyung's initial formal distance had given way to something more complex, and Zara had noticed the way his dark eyes tracked her movements when he thought she was not paying attention. There was possessiveness in his attention that should have been concerning, but instead felt like a form of protection that extended beyond their agreed terms. When he reached across the dinner table to adjust a strand of hair that had escaped from her neat bun, the gesture was casual but intimate in a way that made her breath catch. His fingers were warm against her cheek, and she found herself leaning into the contact before realizing what she was doing. "You have been working too hard," Park Jin-hyung said softly, his hand lingering near her face longer than necessary. "Your medical boards are next month, and you are prepared. There is no need to exhaust yourself with additional study." The concern in his voice was genuine, and Zara realized that somewhere during the past 3 months, Park Jin-hyung had begun to care about her welfare in ways that had nothing to do with her usefulness to his organization. She had become something more valuable than an employee, and that shift had created intimacy that was both comforting and dangerous. Their peaceful routine was interrupted the following week when Zara's mother called with news that made her blood run cold. 2 men in expensive suits had approached her mother at the hospital, asking casual questions about Zara's new circumstances and expressing polite curiosity about her improved financial situation. They were very courteous, her mother explained, but there was something about their questions that made me uncomfortable. They seemed to know things about your living situation and work that I had not mentioned, and they asked specifically about your relationship with Park Jin-hyung. Zara felt panic rising in her throat as the implications of this encounter became clear. Someone was investigating her connection to Park Jin-hyung, and they were willing to approach her vulnerable mother to gather information. The safety and security she had found over the past 3 months suddenly felt fragile and threatened. "What exactly did they ask?" Zara pressed, trying to keep her voice calm while her mind raced through possibilities. "They wanted to know how long you had been working for him, whether you lived in his property, and if you were involved in his business operations beyond medical services," her mother replied. "I told them I knew very little about your work, but they seemed to think I was being deliberately unhelpful." The conversation ended with Zara promising to visit the following day, but she immediately called Park Jin-hyung's direct number, knowing that this development required his immediate attention and response. Park Jin-hyung arrived at her apartment within 20 minutes, his usual controlled demeanor replaced by cold fury that was somehow more frightening than any display of temper she had ever witnessed. When she described the encounter her mother had described, his dark eyes took on a quality of calculating anger that made it clear someone had made a serious mistake in targeting her family. "The Kim Syndicate has been investigating my operations for the past month," Park Jin-hyung explained, his voice carrying deadly quiet precision. "They are attempting to identify vulnerabilities and pressure points that could be used to compromise my organization. Your mother was approached because they have identified you as someone whose welfare I value." The fact that rival criminals knew enough about her relationship with Park Jin-hyung to target her family filled Zara with terror that was both immediate and bone-deep. She had believed that discretion and secrecy would protect her and her mother from any consequences of her association with his world, but clearly their enemies were more observant and more willing to threaten innocent people than she had understood. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected that Park Jin-hyung's response would involve methods she preferred not to think about too specifically. "Now I remind everyone in Seoul why threatening what belongs to me is a mistake that people make only once," Park Jin-hyung replied, pulling out his phone to make calls that would mobilize resources she could only guess at. Within hours, security had been dramatically increased around both Zara's apartment building and her mother's hospital. Men in dark suits positioned themselves at strategic locations, and Zara noticed that her mother was moved to a private wing with restricted access and guards who maintained professional vigilance without drawing attention to their purpose. Park Jin-hyung informed her that the 2 men who had approached her mother would not be making any additional inquiries about anyone or anything, his tone making it clear that their methods of information gathering had been permanently curtailed. He did not provide details about how this had been accomplished, and Zara understood that such specifics were not her concern. The incident served as a stark reminder that accepting Park Jin-hyung's protection meant entering a world where enemies existed and where threats could materialize without warning. But it also demonstrated the extent of his commitment to her safety and his willingness to take decisive action when her welfare was threatened. Your mother will remain under discreet protection for as long as necessary, Park Jin-hyung told her that evening, his dark eyes holding hers with unmistakable intensity. And you will understand that your safety is now my highest priority, above all other considerations. The possessiveness in his voice should have been alarming, but instead Zara found it deeply reassuring to know that Park Jin-hyung's resources and attention were focused on protecting her from dangers she had not even known existed. She was no longer just an employee who had stumbled into his world. She had become someone whose welfare mattered to him personally, and that status came with both security and complications she was only beginning to understand. The vulnerability came unexpectedly on a Thursday evening when Park Jin-hyung arrived at Zara's apartment carrying a bottle of wine she had never seen before and an expression that suggested something significant was weighing on his mind. Instead of their usual dinner conversation about her medical progress or her mother's improving condition, he moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's financial district and stood silently watching the city lights sparkle in the darkness below. Zara had learned to read his moods over the past 4 months, and tonight something was different. The controlled intensity that defined Park Jin-hyung's presence seemed more fragile somehow, as if whatever thoughts occupied his mind were creating cracks in the careful composure he maintained in all their previous interactions. You have been wondering why I chose to protect you that first night in room 8, Park Jin-hyung said without turning away from the window, his voice carrying a quality she had never heard before. The question had occurred to her many times, but she had never felt comfortable asking directly. His decision to show mercy rather than eliminate a potential security risk had shaped everything that followed, and Zara suspected that understanding his motivation would reveal something important about the man who had transformed her life so completely. I told you that my associates believed your silence required permanent solutions, Park Jin-hyung continued, finally turning to face her with dark eyes that seemed more vulnerable than she had ever seen them. What I did not tell you is that their recommendation was standard protocol for situations like yours, and that I had approved such measures many times before without hesitation. He moved to the leather seating area where they usually shared dinner, but instead of sitting across from her, as was his habit, Park Jin-hyung settled beside her on the sofa, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of his expensive cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. You reminded me of someone I had failed to protect, he said quietly, his hands folded in his lap as he stared at the wine bottle without making any move to open it. Someone whose safety should have been my highest priority, but who died because I was too focused on building power to notice she needed help. Zara felt her breath catch as she realized that Park Jin-hyung was about to share something deeply personal, something that explained the protective obsession he had demonstrated toward her welfare from their very first meeting. She remained silent, understanding instinctively that whatever he was preparing to tell her required space and patience. I had a younger sister, Park Jin-hyung began, his voice taking on a tone of carefully controlled emotion. Her name was Park Minju, and she was everything good in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything innocent or beautiful. Sweet, kind, trusting, everything that I had learned not to be in order to survive and build the organization that would eventually make us both safe and secure. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a photograph, a small snapshot that he placed on the coffee table between them with careful reverence. The image showed a young woman with delicate features and a bright smile, clearly related to Park Jin-hyung, but radiating warmth and gentleness that contrasted sharply with his controlled intensity. She was 23 when she met a man who seemed perfect for her, Park Jin-hyung continued, his dark eyes fixed on the photograph with an expression of profound regret. Charming, attentive, from a good family with legitimate business interests. Everything I thought I wanted for her because it represented safety and normalcy, qualities that my world could never provide. Zara could hear the pain in his voice despite his efforts to maintain emotional distance from the memories he was sharing. Whatever had happened to Park Minju had clearly shaped everything about her brother's subsequent life, and explained the fierce protectiveness he had shown towards Zara from the moment he decided she was worth saving. The man she loved seemed wonderful for exactly 6 months, Park Jin-hyung said, his voice becoming harder and more controlled. Then he began isolating her from friends and family, controlling her activities, monitoring her communications. Classic patterns that I should have recognized, but I was building my empire and eliminating threats to my organization, too distracted by expansion and power to notice my sister was becoming trapped by someone who had identified her as an easy target. He picked up the photograph, holding it with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered to him personally. The possessiveness and control escalated into physical violence, financial abuse, and psychological manipulation that destroyed her sense of self-worth and convinced her that she deserved the treatment she was receiving. By the time I realized what was happening, she had been completely isolated and was too terrified to ask for help. Zara felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to Park Jin-hyung describe his sister's situation, recognizing elements that paralleled her own experience with desperation and vulnerability. The difference was that Park Minju had not encountered someone like her brother soon enough to escape the danger that surrounded her. When I finally understood what he was doing to her, I moved to eliminate the threat immediately, Park Jin-hyung continued, his voice becoming deadly quiet. But he anticipated my intervention and escalated to lethal violence before I could reach her. Park Minju was murdered by the man she loved, killed because she had tried to leave him and because I had taken too long to recognize that she needed protection. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and guilt that had clearly haunted Park Jin-hyung for years. Zara could see the way his hands tightened slightly around the photograph, and she understood that his sister's death had fundamentally changed everything about how he approached relationships, responsibility, and the protection of people he valued. I built this organization to ensure that nothing could threaten what belonged to me, but I failed to protect the person who mattered most, Park Jin-hyung said, finally setting the photograph back on the table and looking directly into Zara's eyes. When I saw you in room 8, terrified and trapped by circumstances beyond your control, I knew I was being given a second chance to do what I had failed to do for Park Minju. The revelation explained everything about Park Jin-hyung's immediate decision to protect her, his generous proposition, and his continued attention to every aspect of her welfare. Zara was not just an employee who had stumbled into his world. She was his opportunity to save someone he could not save before, to prove that he had learned from his failure and would not allow another innocent person to be destroyed by violence he had the power to prevent. You saved me because I reminded you of your sister, Zara said softly, understanding finally why her safety had become so important to him so quickly. I protected you because you deserved protection and because I had the resources to provide it, Park Jin-hyung corrected, his dark eyes holding hers with unmistakable intensity. But you have given me something I did not expect and had not hoped to find again. What is that? She asked, though something in his expression suggested she already knew the answer. Peace, Park Jin-hyung replied simply. For the first time in years, I come home to someone whose presence makes this dark world bearable. You make me remember that there is more to life than power and revenge, more to existence than eliminating threats and building empires that protect nothing meaningful. The admission was more vulnerable than anything Zara had expected from a man who projected such controlled strength in every other aspect of his life. She reached out instinctively to touch his hand, offering the comfort she would have provided to any patient dealing with profound loss and unresolved grief. Park Jin-hyung's fingers closed around hers with gentle firmness, and for the first time since their relationship had begun, the careful distance he maintained seemed to dissolve completely. His thumb traced across her knuckles with reverent attention, and Zara felt her pulse quicken at the intimacy of the contact. You are not your sister, and I am not the man who hurt her, Zara said quietly, recognizing that Park Jin-hyung needed to hear those words even though they both understood the fundamental differences in their situations. No, Park Jin-hyung agreed, his voice becoming warmer and softer than she had ever heard it. You are strong where she was vulnerable, practical where she was trusting, capable where she was dependent. And I am not a man who pretends love to hide violence. I am a man who uses violence to protect what I love. The word hung between them with weight that changed everything about their relationship. Love was not something Park Jin-hyung would admit lightly or without complete certainty, and his willingness to speak it aloud made clear that whatever existed between them had moved far beyond business arrangements or protective obligation. When he leaned forward to kiss her, Zara understood that accepting his touch meant crossing a line they could never uncross. But 4 months of safety, generosity, and genuine care had created trust that made the decision simple rather than complicated. Park Jin-hyung had proven his devotion through actions rather than words, and she found herself responding to his kiss with emotion that had been building since their first evening together. The kiss was gentle but possessive, claiming her with reverence rather than force, and Zara felt her carefully maintained boundaries dissolving under the warmth of his attention. When they broke apart, Park Jin-hyung's dark eyes searched her face with the same careful intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him personally. "You are mine," he said softly, the words carrying certainty rather than question. "And I am yours, if you will have me." Before Zara could respond with words that would have acknowledged feelings she was finally ready to admit, Park Jin-hyung's phone rang with the sharp urgency that indicated emergency communication from his security team. The moment of intimacy shattered as he answered with the controlled efficiency that signaled immediate danger. "Sir, we have a problem," the voice on the other end reported, tinny but clear through the phone speaker. "The target's mother has been taken from the hospital. Professional extraction, no witnesses, no trace evidence. They left a message for the target." Zara felt the blood drain from her face as the words registered. Her mother had been kidnapped by people professional enough to extract her from a secured medical facility without leaving evidence, and they had specifically left communication intended for her attention. This was not random violence or opportunistic crime. This was calculated strategy designed to force her cooperation in something she would otherwise never consider. "What does the message say?" Park Jin-hyung asked, his voice becoming deadly quiet as he prepared to hear whatever demand had been made. "They want the target to plant a tracking device in your primary vehicle by tomorrow at noon, or the mother dies slowly and publicly," the security officer reported. They provided technical specifications for the device and pickup instructions for when the task is completed. Park Jin-hyung's expression shifted into something cold and calculating that reminded Zara exactly what kind of man she had been sharing intimate moments with just seconds before. His world was one where enemies kidnapped innocent people to force cooperation, where threats were backed by genuine willingness to commit murder, and where her safety depended entirely on his ability to outmaneuver people who had no moral limitations. "The Kim Syndicate has made their move," Park Jin-hyung said, ending the call and turning to face Zara with eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. "They want you to betray my location and movements so they can eliminate me permanently. Your mother's life is the leverage they are using to ensure your cooperation." Zara felt panic rising in her throat as the full scope of the situation became clear. Her mother was being held by criminals who would kill her without hesitation if their demands were not met, but meeting their demands would result in Park Jin-hyung's death and the destruction of the organization that had provided her with safety and security. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, though she already understood that there was no choice that did not result in devastating consequences for someone she cared about. "You are supposed to choose between your mother's life and my trust," Park Jin-hyung replied with brutal honesty. "And they are counting on the certainty that any daughter would sacrifice anything to save her mother, regardless of the broader consequences." The impossible choice stretched before her like a chasm with no bridge, forcing her to decide between the man who had saved her life and transformed her circumstances, and the woman who had given her life and supported every dream she had ever pursued. There was no option that preserved both relationships, and Zara realized that accepting Park Jin-hyung's protection had always carried the risk that his enemies would eventually force exactly this kind of decision. Looking into his dark eyes, she saw understanding rather than accusation, as if he had always known that her loyalty would ultimately be tested by threats against the people she loved most. Park Jin-hyung would not blame her for choosing her mother's life, but he would not forgive betrayal, and their relationship would not survive her cooperation with his enemies. The next 12 hours would determine not only her mother's fate, but whether the love Park Jin-hyung had just admitted would be strong enough to survive the choice she was about to make. The tracking device was smaller than Zara had expected, no larger than a coin, but dense with technology that would broadcast Park Jin-hyung's location to people who intended to use that information to kill him. She held it in her trembling palm as she stood beside his black Mercedes in the underground garage, knowing that attaching it to his vehicle represented a betrayal that would destroy everything between them while potentially saving her mother's life. The pickup instructions had been simple and terrifying. Retrieve the device from a dead drop location, plant it on Park Jin-hyung's primary vehicle before noon, and wait for confirmation that the task was complete before her mother would be released. Failure to comply would result in her mother's death within hours. Broadcast live to ensure that Zara understood the consequences of defying their demands. She had spent the entire night wrestling with the impossible choice, weighing her mother's life against Park Jin-hyung's trust and safety. Every rational calculation led to the same conclusion. She could not allow her mother to be murdered because of her association with Park Jin-hyung's world, regardless of what that decision might cost her personally. But as she prepared to attach the device to the undercarriage of his Mercedes, Zara made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of simply completing the betrayal and hoping for the best possible outcome, she would plant the device as demanded but confess everything to Park Jin-hyung immediately afterward. Her mother's kidnappers expected her to maintain silence until their operation was complete, but Zara refused to allow Park Jin-hyung to walk unknowingly into whatever trap they were planning. The magnetic attachment clicked softly as the device secured itself to the vehicle's frame, and Zara felt a piece of her soul die as she completed the task that would enable his enemies to track his movements. But instead of leaving the garage and pretending nothing had happened, she positioned herself beside the elevator and waited for Park Jin-hyung to arrive for his morning departure. When the elevator doors opened 20 minutes later, Park Jin-hyung emerged wearing another impeccably tailored suit and carrying the controlled confidence that characterized all his movements. His dark eyes took in her presence immediately, noting her unusual location and the tension that was written across her face despite her efforts to appear calm. "You are not scheduled to accompany me this morning," Park Jin-hyung observed, his voice carrying the slight questioning tone he used when something deviated from expected patterns. "I need to tell you something before you leave," Zara said, her voice steadier than she had expected given the magnitude of what she was about to confess. Park Jin-hyung studied her expression with the careful attention he gave to everything that might indicate danger or deception. Something in her demeanor must have triggered his instincts, because his hand moved subtly toward the inside of his jacket where she knew he carried a weapon that would be used without hesitation if he perceived genuine threat. "What is it you need to tell me?" he asked, his voice becoming more formal as his protective instincts engaged. "I planted a tracking device on your car," Zara said simply, deciding that direct confession was the only approach that preserved any possibility of his understanding or forgiveness. The silence that followed stretched between them like a physical force, heavy with implications that would reshape everything about their relationship. Park Jin-hyung's expression shifted from surprise to cold fury with frightening speed, and Zara found herself looking into the face of a man who had eliminated people for far lesser betrayals than the one she had just admitted. "You have been working with my enemies," Park Jin-hyung stated, his voice carrying deadly quiet precision that made clear he was calculating responses that would permanently address the security breach she represented. "No," Zara said quickly, recognizing that she had perhaps seconds to explain before Park Jin-hyung acted to protect himself and his organization from what appeared to be deliberate treachery. "They kidnapped my mother yesterday evening and threatened to kill her if I did not plant the device. I completed their task, but I am telling you immediately so that you can protect yourself from whatever they are planning." Park Jin-hyung's dark eyes searched her face with intensity that felt like physical examination, looking for signs of deception or manipulation that would confirm his worst suspicions about her loyalty and trustworthiness. Zara forced herself to maintain steady eye contact despite her terror, knowing that any attempt to hide or deflect would be interpreted as evidence of guilt. "They took her from the secured medical facility while your people were supposed to be protecting her," Zara continued, desperation making her words rush together as she tried to convey the full scope of the situation before Park Jin-hyung concluded she was lying. "They left instructions for me to retrieve and plant the tracking device, with proof that they would kill her slowly and publicly if I refused to cooperate. The mention of his security failure seemed to shift something in Park Jin-hyung's assessment of the situation. His expression remained dangerous, but the cold calculation was now directed outward rather than toward her, as if he was beginning to understand that she had been coerced rather than recruited by his enemies. "Show me the instructions," Park Jin-hyung commanded, his voice still carrying authority that would not accept refusal or delay. Zara retrieved the burner phone that had been provided with the tracking device, displaying the messages that detailed her mother's kidnapping and the specific demands for her cooperation. Park Jin-hyung read each communication with careful attention, and she could see his fury building as he processed the sophisticated psychological manipulation that had been used to force her betrayal. "They knew exactly how to ensure your cooperation," Park Jin-hyung said finally, his voice becoming warmer but no less controlled. "Threatening your mother was the one leverage that would guarantee you would act against me, regardless of the personal consequences." When he looked at her again, his dark eyes held understanding rather than accusation, and Zara felt relief flooding through her as she realized that Park Jin-hyung recognized the impossible position she had been placed in by his enemies. "You chose to warn me rather than maintain silence until their operation was complete," Park Jin-hyung observed, his tone carrying something that might have been approval. "That decision may have saved both our lives and given us the advantage necessary to rescue your mother." He pulled out his own phone and began making calls with rapid efficiency, mobilizing resources and personnel with the kind of decisive authority that reminded Zara exactly how powerful and dangerous Park Jin-hyung could be when protecting what belonged to him. "The tracking device will remain active, but we will control what information it provides," Park Jin-hyung explained as he coordinated response strategies. "My enemies expect to follow my movements and identify opportunities for ambush, but instead they will be led into situations that serve our purposes rather than theirs." Within 30 minutes, Park Jin-hyung had assembled a response team that included technical specialists, tactical operators, and intelligence analysts who began tracking the signals being broadcast by the device Zara had planted. The sophistication of his organization became apparent as multiple layers of technology were employed to reverse engineer the kidnapping operation and identify the location where her mother was being held. The Kim Syndicate made a fundamental error in their operational planning, Park Jin-hyung explained as real-time intelligence began flowing in from his technical team. "They assumed that threatening your mother would ensure your complete cooperation and silence, but they underestimated both your integrity and my commitment to protecting what is mine." The rescue operation that followed was a masterpiece of military precision and overwhelming force that demonstrated exactly why Park Jin-hyung commanded respect and fear throughout Seoul's criminal landscape. Using the tracking device as bait, his forces drew the Kim Syndicate's attack teams into prepared ambush positions while simultaneously locating and assaulting the facility where Zara's mother was being held. Zara waited in Park Jin-hyung's private office while the operation unfolded, monitoring communications that confirmed the systematic destruction of her mother's kidnappers and the broader Kim Syndicate organization. The reports were clinical and efficient. Targets neutralized, facility secured, hostage recovered unharmed, enemy leadership eliminated. When Park Jin-hyung returned 4 hours later, his expensive suit was rumpled, and he carried the faint metallic scent that suggested recent violence. But his dark eyes held satisfaction and calm certainty that the threat had been permanently resolved. "Your mother is safe and receiving medical attention at the private facility," Park Jin-hyung reported, settling into the chair beside her with the controlled grace that characterized all his movements. "The Kim Syndicate no longer exists as an operational entity, and no one will threaten you or your family again for any reason." The relief was overwhelming, but Zara found herself studying Park Jin-hyung's face and recognizing something in his expression that went beyond professional satisfaction with a successful operation. "You could have eliminated me as a security risk when I admitted planting the device," she said quietly, understanding that his decision to trust her confession rather than treat her as an enemy had required faith in her character that was not guaranteed to be justified. "I could have," Park Jin-hyung agreed, his dark eyes holding hers with unmistakable intensity. But eliminating you would have been the greatest mistake I could have made, because you are worth more to me than any security consideration or organizational concern. He reached for her hands, holding them with gentle firmness that conveyed both possession and reverence. If you had trusted me with the truth about your mother's kidnapping from the beginning, I would have chosen to eliminate the threat rather than allow you to suffer the impossible choice they forced upon you, Park Jin-hyung said, his voice carrying emotion that he rarely allowed others to witness. The admission revealed the depth of his commitment to her welfare and his willingness to prioritize her emotional well-being above his own security concerns. Park Jin-hyung was telling her that her happiness mattered more to him than his safety, and that knowledge created feelings that were both overwhelming and transformative. I was terrified that telling you would force you to choose between my mother's life and your own survival, Zara confessed, finally admitting the fear that had driven her to handle the crisis alone rather than seeking his help. You still do not understand, Park Jin-hyung replied, his thumb tracing across her knuckles with reverent attention. I would choose your welfare above my own without hesitation or regret, because my life has meaning only insofar as it protects and provides for the woman I love. The words hung between them with weight that transformed everything about their relationship. Park Jin-hyung had just declared that her welfare was more important to him than his own survival, and that his love for her superseded every other consideration, including his own safety and the security of his organization. When he leaned forward to kiss her, Zara understood that they had survived the ultimate test of trust and emerged with love that was stronger than betrayal, deeper than fear, and more enduring than any threat his enemies could devise. Park Jin-hyung had proven that his devotion to her was absolute and unconditional, and she had demonstrated that even when forced to betray him, her integrity would not allow her to leave him unprotected. The crisis had revealed the true depth of their connection and established that whatever challenges they might face in the future, they would meet them together with complete trust and unwavering commitment to each other's welfare above all other considerations. The moment that redefined everything between them came 3 days after her mother's rescue, when Park Jin-hyung arrived at Zara's apartment, carrying a small black velvet box that he placed on the coffee table with the same careful reverence he had shown his sister's photograph. The weight of what that box represented settled between them like a promise that would reshape not only their relationship, but their entire future together. Your mother is fully recovered and has been cleared to return home tomorrow, Park Jin-hyung said, his dark eyes holding Zara's with intensity that made clear this conversation would address far more than medical updates. The experimental treatment has been completely successful, and her oncologist expects full remission with no need for additional intervention. The relief of knowing her mother was truly safe and healthy should have been the most important news Zara could receive, but her attention was focused entirely on the velvet box and what Park Jin-hyung's decision to bring it meant about the direction their relationship was taking. She has asked to meet the man who made her recovery possible, Park Jin-hyung continued, his voice carrying warmth that suggested he welcomed the opportunity to be formally introduced as someone significant in Zara's life rather than simply her employer. What did you tell her about us? Zara asked, though she suspected that Park Jin-hyung's response would reveal exactly how he viewed their relationship and what kind of future he intended for them to build together. I told her that I am the man who loves her daughter and intends to ensure that neither of you ever worries about safety or security again, Park Jin-hyung replied, his voice carrying certainty rather than question about Zara's feelings or her willingness to accept the commitment he was offering. He reached for the velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring that was both elegant and substantial, clearly custom designed by someone who understood exactly what kind of jewelry was appropriate for a woman who would become the wife of Seoul's most powerful man. The center stone was a flawless diamond surrounded by smaller gems that caught the light with fire that seemed to promise permanence and protection. You are mine, Zara Williams, Park Jin-hyung said, his voice carrying possession and reverence in equal measure as he removed the ring from its cushion. I protect what is mine with everything I have, and I claim what I love completely and without reservation. The declaration was both tender and possessive, acknowledging the power dynamic that would always exist between them while affirming that his claim on her came from love rather than mere ownership. Park Jin-hyung was offering her security that extended far beyond their current arrangement, protection that would make her untouchable through marriage into his family. "And you are mine," Zara replied, understanding that accepting his proposal meant claiming him in return, broken pieces and all. "Your past, your darkness, your empire, everything you are belongs to me just as much as I belong to you." Park Jin-hyung's smile was soft and genuine as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the weight of it both substantial and surprisingly comfortable, as if it had been designed specifically for her hand. The fit was perfect, another reminder of how thoroughly Park Jin-hyung planned everything that mattered to him personally. "When I marry you, you become Mrs. Park Jin-hyung, untouchable by anyone who might consider threatening what belongs to me," he explained, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when discussing business arrangements that would have lasting consequences. "Your safety becomes a matter of family honor, and your welfare is protected by every resource at my disposal." The legal and social protection that would come with marriage to Park Jin-hyung was significant, but Zara found herself more moved by the personal commitment he was making than by the practical benefits his status would provide. He was offering her not just security but partnership, asking her to share his life completely rather than simply accepting his protection. "I want you to continue your medical practice, but within the structure of my organization where your skills can serve our family, while maintaining the discretion that our circumstances require," Park Jin-hyung continued, outlining a future that would allow her to pursue her professional calling while remaining part of his world. The proposal was comprehensive and thoughtful, addressing every aspect of how their marriage would function practically while preserving the emotional connection that had developed between them over the past months. Park Jin-hyung was not asking her to abandon her identity or ambitions, but rather to integrate them into a life they would build together. "I accept," Zara said simply, recognizing that her decision was both inevitable and completely right given everything they had experienced together and everything Park Jin-hyung had proven about his commitment to her welfare. The kiss that followed was deep and claiming, sealing their engagement with physical intimacy that acknowledged the complete emotional surrender they were making to each other. When they broke apart, Park Jin-hyung's dark eyes held satisfaction and possessive joy that transformed his severe features into something approaching happiness. 6 months later, Dr. Zara Park stood in the private medical suite of Seoul's most exclusive private hospital, treating a patient whose injuries had resulted from activities she preferred not to examine too closely, but whose recovery was her professional responsibility. Her medical practice had evolved to serve the Park family organization exclusively, providing care that was both exceptional and completely confidential. The wedding had been a small, elegant affair attended only by her mother and Park Jin-hyung's closest associates, but the legal and social transformation had been profound. As Mrs. Park Jin-hyung, Zara commanded respect and protection throughout Seoul's business community, both legitimate and otherwise. Her status as the wife of the city's most powerful man made her untouchable, while her medical skills made her invaluable. Her mother had recovered completely and was living comfortably in a luxury apartment that Park Jin-hyung had provided, with access to the finest medical care and security that ensured her safety and peace of mind. The experimental cancer treatment had been entirely successful, and the regular checkups showed no signs of recurrence or complications. Park Jin-hyung had kept every promise he had made, providing security, luxury, and purpose while demonstrating daily that her happiness and welfare were his highest priorities. Their marriage was built on mutual possession and protection, with love that had deepened through shared trials and absolute trust. The penthouse they now shared had been redesigned to accommodate both his need for security and her medical practice, with a fully equipped treatment facility that rivaled any hospital emergency room. Zara found genuine satisfaction in providing care that saved lives while maintaining the discretion that Park Jin-hyung's world required. Their evening routine had evolved into something that brought both of them peace and contentment. Park Jin-hyung would return from managing his empire, leaving the darkness of his business world outside their home, and they would share dinner and conversation that reminded them both why they had chosen to build a life together. Tonight, as they stood together on the terrace overlooking Seoul's glittering skyline, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought them from that first terrifying encounter in room 8. To this moment of complete security and mutual devotion. Do you ever regret walking into the wrong room? Park Jin-hyung asked, his arms wrapped around her waist as they watched the city spread out below them like jewels scattered across dark velvet. Never, Zara replied without hesitation, leaning back against his chest and feeling the solid strength that had protected her through every challenge they had faced. That mistake brought me to you, and you brought me to everything I never knew I needed. Park Jin-hyung's hold tightened slightly, possessive and protective in the way that had become as natural as breathing between them. I failed to save my sister, but I was given the opportunity to save you. And in saving you, I found peace I never expected to experience again. The confession carried weight that acknowledged both his tragic past and the healing their relationship had provided. Park Jin-hyung had found his second chance to protect someone he loved, while Zara had discovered security and purpose beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. You saved me too, she said softly, understanding that their rescue of each other had been mutual and complete. You took a desperate woman with nowhere to turn and gave her everything she needed to become who she was meant to be. As they stood together in the peaceful luxury of their shared life, both Zara and Park Jin-hyung understood that they had found something rare and precious. Love that was strong enough to survive betrayal, trust that was deeper than fear, and commitment that would endure whatever challenges their future might bring. The girl who had walked into the wrong VIP lounge seeking money for her mother's cancer treatment had become the cherished wife of Seoul's most powerful man, protected by resources that made her untouchable and loved by a man whose devotion was absolute and unwavering. Park Jin-hyung had transformed from a cold criminal who eliminated threats without mercy into a man whose greatest purpose was ensuring the happiness and security of the woman who had given his life meaning beyond power and empire. Together, they had built a future that satisfied both their needs and their dreams, where danger had been replaced by safety, desperation by abundance, and loneliness by love that would last forever. The mistake that had brought them together had become the foundation for a life neither could have imagined alone, but which they had created together through trust, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to each other's welfare above all else.